I woke to the taste of burnt oil and prayer, handed a lasgun and one rule: do not give the commissar reason to shoot you. The weapon lay against my shoulder like an accusation, warm from someone else's hands, its stock scuffed and smelling faintly of cordite. Around me the transport hummed, a body of metal that breathed dust and diesel, and men shifted like a single animal, trying to find comfort on a hard floor. The world beyond the ramp was a scarred horizon, black ribs of ruined factories, and a sky the color of old paper. The drill sergeant's voice cut through it all, a metronome hammered into bone. Left, right, left, right. Move so you do not think. They had wrenched me from a life that, once, had a name. I could still conjure the sound of it at odd moments, like a candle flame you hide in a pocket. A town where the bakery fired at dawn, and the mayor's wife counted coins in a steady hand. That life belonged to someone who kept his knives oiled and his promises kept under a warm roof. The guard had folded that person into a gray sleeve. New clothes smelled of cold metal, and rationed coffee, the uniform fit like a promise, made in a language I didn't understand. My name on the inside of the tunic was a thin strip of paper, ink running where sweat had claimed it. I pressed my thumb to the ragged letters and tried to memorize the shape. Training is a calculus of small deaths. They taught rhythms so you moved without thinking. They measured your wake and sleep in increments. Sleep in 50 minutes, march in 51. Each hour was a bar of music drilled into you until instincts replaced memory. We learned to dress wounds by cold light, to count the number of breaths between orders, to stand up even when the world tried to pull you down. The sergeant did not try to make us brave. He wanted us useful. Usefulness is what keeps you breathing on a line where bodies are currency, and victory is measured in who stays standing at dawn. Hunger became another teacher. Rations were cardboard and thin meat pressed into uniform shapes. We learned how to make soup out of one ration and a scrap of morale. A spoon passed between two men could be a small sermon. I remember looking at the food and seeing how it outlined who we were now. Expendable by design and yet stubbornly human. My hands found tricks to make the cardboard bearable, a strip of sweetener tucked like contraband, chewing slowly to prolong the comfort. Small rebellions kept a throat from closing. When the commissar walked past, the entire transport straightened to a line so rigid you could bounce a coin on it. He didn't have to do anything, his hat was enough. The rule, do not give the commissar reason to shoot you, sat in the chest like a stone. Names frayed. We called each other by what we could remember, a place, a hunger, a twitch. There was a boy who whistled without thinking, a man with a laugh that cracked like a stick, a woman who kept her hair tucked under her collar because long hair attracted crosses and questions. Conversation was a low fire, never permitted to flare. People traded habits the way they traded smokes. I traded in the old ritual of washing my face at dusk for a clean sleeve wiped once, and for a week it felt like sacrilege. At night, we tried to make sense of the sky. The stars looked the same as they had before, but now they were suspicious, as if someone had smeared oil across them. You learn to read the world by sound. The transport doors opened with the sigh of a machine that has known this work too long. Air hit us, and it tasted of ash and metal and a far-off salt. Beyond the ramp, the ground had the look of a place that had been slept on badly, churned and torn and full of shadows hiding things. The horizon was a whisper of ruin. Engines throbbed somewhere beyond sight, like beasts kept on short leashes. They ordered us in columns, and we moved because the rhythm was in our muscles now, because the sergeant's cadence had become a second heartbeat. The first time I saw someone fall on the march, it was not dramatic. He simply stopped walking. There was no parade of grief or trumpets. Someone knelt, felt for a pulse like checking for heat, and another man put his pack under the fallen's head. The commissar walked by and kept his gaze straight ahead. We all took up the pace. Anything else would be an invitation to notice. I learned how to look without looking, to catalog a wound's color and not let my face change. Compassion is dangerous when it saps the rhythm. A lasgun is a peculiar companion. It is heavier than you expect and disappointingly mundane. Its light cuts air in a clean, dispassionate way. The safety click is a sound that lives in your ear after a week, a tiny promise you make to yourself and break 1,000 times. Men joked about carving their names into the stock, or marking it with something that proved the weapon had a soul. Most of those jokes faded when we saw what happens to joking men. I kept my lasgun close anyway. You learn quick that tools are not merely things, they are excuses and covers, and sometimes the only language everyone on the field speaks. Orders came wrapped tight and with no room for error. We were told where to go and when to arrive, and the reasons were given in abstract nouns that tasted of ceremony. Flank the enemy, hold this sector, deny. There were maps that looked like dances and words like priority that felt like weights. We followed because we were trained to, and because the alternative was to be noticed. Sometimes a voice would ask why we were doing this, and the answer was always the same: because they had a job for us. Jobs were never conversation. They were fences you walked along until the ground gave way. The drill sergeant taught rhythm so you did not think. He would walk in front of us with his boots like a drummer. Eyes forward, he said in a voice that scoured your face. He'd count off in blunt numbers that matched footfalls. When he took his bayonet and angled it into the dirt to show where a line should end, men ducked like it had struck the air. He'd tell us how to move through rubble, how to wedge a door with a pack, how to listen for the sound of a spent engine. The training stripped habits, but kept reflexes. It taught me to sleep in 50 minutes and march in 51. It taught me to wake at the exact pause between orders when the world smelled like burning and someone needed something moved. There were rules about eye contact. You should not look at higher ranks for longer than a blink, unless specifically addressed, and even then your gaze must slide like an oiled hinge. The commissar's presence made men small. He carried himself in a way that suggested final accounting. His words were rare and precise, his inspections surgical. A single raised eyebrow from him could end a man in ways that nothing else could. We learned to keep our faces neutral as coin, to make our stories unreadable. The sergeant called it discipline. The commissar called it honesty. On the edge of the transport, a lieutenant with 2 clean gloves tapped the map case with a finger. He moved fine things with a surgeon's care. "Hold at Sector 9 until reinforcement," he said. His orders were paper instructions that would be upheld by leather and steel. We obeyed because momentum is a kind of law. The ramp closed and the transport breathed once, heavy and slow, as if trying to exhale the smell of us into the night. There was a murmur among the men, a sound like crumpled fabric. Someone laughed quietly, and it sounded like a crack in the world. The first sight of the front was not what I'd expected. It was not banners or drama. It was a long, ugly thing stretched across the land. Trenches that drank rain, barricades built from broken dreams, the occasional skeleton of a vehicle. Smoke coiled like fingers, and gusts of ash fell into our hair. In the distance, fires winked like bad stars. The ground smelled of iron and an animal fear. Above it all, the sky had a color I couldn't name, something between bruise and brass. We filed out of the transport, and the air took our breath in a different way, like a new language asking us to speak. I walked because the rhythm had become a limb. My boots crunched on grit and glass. Each step had the tiny authority of a man refusing to fall out of line. When the first volley came, not aimed at us, but part of the general background, It made the air count itself. Men ducked reflexively, not from fear, but from practice. A woman beside me hissed and reached for the pack at the back of her waist. Her fingers were quick and sure. She had kept a coin in her tunic from the town she was taken from. She pressed it to her teeth as if to taste the memory. Little rebellions lit us like sparklers in the dark. Orders funneled us through a narrow slit of earth where the world seemed to compress. A sergeant shouted something about clearing a foxhole, and we moved in because that's what you do when a call is made, and someone is counting bodies. There was a pause when we hit the open stretch, and I felt something unclench inside me. The desire to survive is not a grand plan. It is a series of tiny decisions. Where to step, when to breathe, how to hold your lace gun. My mind went to the name I had left in a pocket, to the small rituals I still clung to in that gray sleeve. I resolved then, in a moment that tasted like metal and coffee, to keep one thing of the old life intact. Not because it would save me physically, but because it might stop me from being entirely consumed. The lace gun felt heavy and honest in my hands. I adjusted the strap, felt the weight on my shoulder like a promise, and stepped forward into the churn of the front. We moved toward the noise. The sergeant's rhythm pushed us. The commissar's hat cut the sky with its hard edge. Ahead, the land opened into the kind of terrible infinity that makes even practiced men cautious. Somewhere in that expanse, an order would be given, and we would obey. I kept my thumb on the inked strip inside my tunic, and let the name I carried be a small, defiant warmth against the cold of something greater than me. I did not know if it would be enough, but I chose to keep it. Then the ramp sealed, and the column advanced into the battlefield's maw. The trench smelled like wet canvas and old metal. Cold water beaded along the canvas cover and rolled into my collar. Every sound in that narrow cut of earth was amplified. The scrape of leather against wood, a boot's soft thud, the quiet hiss of someone's breath that sounded like a second heartbeat. We passed the time like that, small movements measured, voices kept to a whisper, as if the dark above could hear us. They ran their hands over our weapons like priests blessing relics. A sergeant with a permanent scowl checked the locks on my lace gun, thumbed the charging rod, and told me to keep my finger off the trigger unless I wanted to light up my own squad. His commands were clipped and sure. He called the weapon reliable, the way someone might call a nagging tooth lucky, not because it was, but because you had to believe it. I believed nothing then. I believed only the weight of the gun in my arms and the taste of iron at the back of my mouth when I thought too hard. Commissars walked the line with boots that swallowed mud. I had seen one before, his black coat like a shadow that moved on its own. He didn't smile. He relied on a small plain pistol and a look that could make men confess to crimes they had not yet committed. When he stopped in front of you, your throat tightened. I felt my ribs tense as he leaned close enough for me to see the tiny net of veins in his eyes. No one whispered in his presence. Even the laughter that had sometimes bloomed in the trench died away like a lantern forced out. Ration tins were opened with teeth more often than with mess knives. The food tasted of oil and stale bread, but it filled a hole that nothing else could. A man named Ezra, who'd been my neighbor in the trench since we'd arrived, offered me half his ration without being asked. He had a flat scar under his ear and a laugh that came out in short, shocked bursts. We had not talked about home. Talking about home was like unveiling a photograph of something soft and fragile and giving it to the earth. Still, in the way men do, we traded names and small secrets, where each of us had learned to shoot, who had a sister back on some world we had never seen. It made a map of human things in a place that refused them. At dusk, the officer's voice came over the vox, smooth and deliberately calm. "Advance at 2200, he said. "Take the ridge, hold it. No retreat." The line went quiet after that. Voices were clipped into rationed words, like fuel handed out in spoonfuls. My hands shook when I strapped on my pack, not from cold, from the knowledge that orders were not suggestions, and that obedience could be the only thing standing between a man and a public execution. We practiced obeying even when our bodies wanted to say no. Drill was a muscle memory that stiffened into a reflex. Sling the lace gun, check the safety, move on command. The sergeant's voice turned the motions into rituals. Eyes down, keep tight, don't crowd the man in front. The words were the same ones they had used to teach us to chew without choking and to swallow without tasting our fear. That obedience settled like a second skin. It kept you alive long enough to find the courage to act. Night came with an artillery glitter in the distance, shots punching the sky and dropping their light like angry stars. The ground trembled briefly and then fell silent, as if the world had blinked and decided it was tired. In the moments between bursts, I could hear the men breathing. It was a chorus of lungs and resolve. Someone hummed under his breath, a tune from a place that had known summer. The sound was small and human, and it snapped me back from thinking about what would come. We crawled out to the assembly point where the parapet was lower, and the world beyond the trench looked like a vast, waiting throat. The no-man's land stretched out as a patchwork of mud and bone-white stumps of trees. Stars were smeared thin by the smoke and the cloud of artillery dust. The only clear things were the shapes of the barricades and the dull gleam of sentries' bayonets. I could feel the weight of the rifles around me and the steady crush of my own breath inside my helmet. The sergeant counted us off with a drum of fingers on his thigh, each name a small salvation. When they left a gap, you could see the worry settle like frost. Orders were short. 2 waves, the voice said. First wave to take the peg, second wave to exploit. The words were clinical, like a doctor describing a procedure, not a promise. We were told the enemy lines were thin, that their artillery was weakened, that their morale would break. All those assurances lined up like neat little lies to steady us. I had learned not to trust promises that smelled of planning. Instead, I watched the men around me, watched how the younger ones swallowed hard and how the older ones looked as if someone had already taken a piece of them. The night smelled of coal and old blood. I couldn't name the scents properly, they were all just the smell of war. My fingers found the seam of my last letter home in my jacket, the edges soft with handling. I had not planned on reading it now. I let it stay there, pressed to my chest, like a fossil of a life I might never reach again. Ezra nudged my elbow and nodded toward the line of low lights that showed the enemy positions. He didn't need to say anything. He had a look on his face as if he were holding a small, dangerous thing up to the light to see if it was real. The first volley from the enemy hit farther than the officers had guessed. It splashed into the ground ahead of us, throwing mud like a wave. It was not meant to kill any of us. Then it was meant to remind us of the risk. The second volley was closer. Pieces of earth showered my helmet. My laser gun felt suddenly too big for me, cumbersome and implausible. The sergeant barked and we moved, a string of men trying to be a single, unbreakable line. Obedience made us functional. Fear made us sharp. We reached the low bank where the first wave was to go over. The sergeant checked his watch. Time seemed to thicken. He leaned in and his voice was low. You move when I move. You stop when I stop. You keep your head and you keep the man beside you. It was not encouragement, it was instruction. The consistency of his directions steadied me. Obeying felt less like loss and more like an act of joining. We were a machine built of breathing pieces. In a pocket of my jacket, I had a small trinket, a coin stamped with some planetary crest I had pocketed for luck. It was warm from my hand. Ezra clapped me on the shoulder, hard enough to hurt, and said, "Bring that coin back." The way he said it wasn't a joke, it was a pact. I wanted to say the same to him, but my throat locked. Instead, I imagined the coin making it through to the other side like a blind prayer. The signal to go came sudden as a struck bell. The world seemed to compress into a single pulse. The sergeant snapped his hand, and 100 men moved together. We poured over the lip like water finding a new channel. The slope fell away, and for a moment all the training snapped into an instinctive answer. Keep your head down, run low, pass the man in front when he stumbles. The night swallowed sound, and then vomited it back. Shouts, a sudden bright crack that might have been a last blast, the tinny rattle of something bursting overhead. As we crossed the open ground, the ground itself betrayed us. Mud sucked at boots. A man in front of me went down, and the echo of his fall turned into a score of other sounds. Grunts, a small curse, someone else grabbing for the barricade. I felt my own chest tighten like a spring, pulled taut by the knowledge that a single wrong move could unravel everything. Obedience guided my feet, training guided my hands. And in the small, secret corners of my mind, the thought that maybe, just maybe, we might break through. One stubborn hope passed like contraband among the men. We reached the first enemy position, under a sky that had gone a strange, distant gray. The place smelled of smoke and something like burnt cloth. We hit them hard and close. It was a jumble, more intimate than the practice drills had ever prepared us for. Eyes met eyes in the dark, and for a heartbeat, each of us had the rude, astonishing realization that the men on the other side were not beasts. They were people. That realization was a quick, sharp pain because it made the work of killing feel obscene. We did what we were trained to do anyway. There was no time for moral homework in the face of an incoming bayonet. Somewhere behind me there was a yell, a commissar's voice barking so loud it felt like a physical thing. He moved like an animal bred for control, unafraid of being in the damage. His presence was a blade that cut through hesitation. Men straightened like they had been plugged back into wires. The fight that followed was all hands and muscle. It was less about tactics and more about personal rawness. The lasgun's throw of light was brief and crude. There were moments where everything slowed and then contracted. Fingers finding collars, a shoulder pushing, a man rolling away from a fall and grunting as he tried to pull himself up again. When it was over, when the first line fell back and we found a place to breathe, the world seemed both louder and emptier. No one who had been in that tangle spoke much. We checked wounds in a quick, efficient way. No one wanted to look too long at the faces that might not move again. Ezra's hand was black with soot when he found me, and he grinned in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Still have that coin?" he asked. His voice shook. I almost told him the truth, that my coin felt like it had grown heavier, as if the night had put weight on promises. But instead, I slid it back into my pocket and nodded. The officer's voice came over the vox again, crisp and simple. "Hold what you've taken. Prepare to push further when the second wave is ready." A new round of artillery boomed far off, reminding us that this night was not yet done with us. We consolidated positions, dug in where we could, and tried to make safe the ground we had just stolen. I found a shallow depression behind a broken wall and sat there, the cold creeping through my uniform, thinking of nothing that mattered and everything that did. Commissar moved along the line, inspecting hands and helmets, like a man who counted sins with a ruler. He paused at my spot and looked down at me. The light caught his face, and for an instant I could see the creases that told of nights like this, of watching men move and die. He didn't smile. He placed his hand on my shoulder, firm and decisive, and said, "Do you understand why you fight?" The question was not rhetorical. It demanded an answer the way a blade demands metal. I wanted to say everything: my home, the coin, Ezra's grin. But the truth I gave was shorter and cleaner. "Because I was told to," I said. The commissar's mouth tightened. He did not tell me I was wrong. He tipped his chin toward the dark, where the second wave would rise, and said, "Then stay alive until they've done their part. Make your obedience mean something." His words were not comfort. They were a task. I felt the responsibility like a new weight, different from my pack, heavier. It settled between my shoulder blades and steeled my hands. Around me, men prepared. Packs were tightened, guns were checked, bandages were readied. A hush grew as the second wave formed, a low, humming energy like a beast waiting to be let out. They would be the ones to push into the teeth of the enemy and either widen the breach or die trying. The sergeant crouched by my side and leaned in, his face close enough for me to see the sweat on his upper lip. "Keep your head," he said simply. "Watch my hand." His words were small, practical things to hold on to. I looked at the men rising behind us, at the thin line of figures against the smoke-streaked horizon, and felt the tightness in my chest change into something less frantic and more careful. Obedience had brought me here. Now it became the thing I used to protect something else. This moment, this thin hold on ground that we had bought with our breath. The second wave began to gather, a cluster of bodies and intent ready to move when given the chance. In the dark, I felt the shape of the coming assault, like a promise and a threat. My hands closed on my lasgun, fingers finding the familiar grooves. I adjusted my grip and breathed in. The world outside the trench narrowed to one single line, the edge where we would go over. The sergeant looked at his watch again, then up at the sky. We were about to go forward. My first step into battle was sound and heat and the taste of ash. The lasgun bucked in hands that had never been meant for killing, a new weight that answered every thought with a click and a recoil. Someone laughed 2 beats before the world took it away. I could feel the laugh hanging in my mouth like a call I could not answer. Men I had joked with that morning went quiet, as if their voices had been pointed away from us by the wind. I could not tell which memory kept me upright: the smell of my mother's bread, the joke we shared at dawn, or simply the animal will to stand when others fell beside you. We took the broken ridge by force and by the stubbornness of a dozen tired bodies. The ground gave way in black craters, and the sky was the color of old coal. Tracer lines stitched across it, thin veins of green and orange. We climbed over the carcasses of shattered emplacements, boots slipping in powdered masonry, and when the firing stopped long enough to count the cost, faces that had been speaking moments ago were only masks. I learned to count quickly then. 1 finger for a shoulder that did not move, 2 for a boot turned the wrong way. No one told me how to measure the way the world rewrote itself with each stopped breath. I remember the moment I fired. It was a reflex sharpened by fear. A shadow moved where a laughing voice had been, and the instinct to live snapped my finger closed. The last bolt struck the shape, and the shape did not move. In the space that followed, I felt like a man who had stepped off a pier and still had the sound of water in his ears. There was no going back from the instant the shot left my hands, no ceremony, no trial. Just the cold, small clarity of survival, and the sticky question of whether the survival had to sit on the bones of another. I kept thinking of the captain's face then, neutral, efficient, calling for us to press on. His order did not wait for me to forgive myself. The barrage that met us beyond the ridge had a rhythm that made it easier to forget anything but the immediate present. Shells fell in a pattern. Thunder, bruise, silence. The smell of burnt fabric and hot metal filled my lungs until I had to force air in small, measured pulls. The lasgun's hum became a counterpoint to the artillery's bass, and for a while those 2 sounds were the only grammar I understood. When shrapnel chewed through a nearby wall, the noise was like a city of glass collapsing. A man next to me did not cry out. He slid down as if somebody had pulled a string. I put my hand on his shoulder because it was the only human thing left to do. There was no warmth beneath the uniform. We crossed through the cratered earth in a line that resembled a procession. The sergeant kept shouting positions, and each command was a small anchor thrown into the chaos, pulling us toward the next step. I learned to follow the anchor. When the captain barked for a flanking cut, we obeyed as if the words themselves were armor. A sniper's beam found a shape that had curried too close to a hollow. We shifted, spaced, breathed. The hole in my chest felt like a place where a clock had stopped. My heartbeat was loud as a marching drum, but it did not tell time anymore. There was a boy in the squad who still carried a photograph folded inside a grease-stained pack. He kept it like a prayer, fingers worrying the corner until it softened. I watched him sometimes when the firing allowed. His face would go inward, like he was listening to someone in a different room. I could not take my eyes off that photograph. It was the only thing anyone held between themselves and the shape the war wanted them to become. Yet when the barrage swung wide and a piece of the sky broke near us, he did not have time to fold the photo away. It lifted out on a sudden wind and sailed, a white flag with a life written on it, and I saw it go before I could catch it. A man fell close enough that I heard the breath leave him in a sound like a small animal. We were trained to not look, but grief is stubborn and disbelief louder than command. I knelt because it was the right size for help, because it felt like a thing you did to honor someone who was still warm enough to feel. The sergeant grabbed my collar and hauled me back by the scrap of material. "Move," he spat. He had the same look as the captain, fatigue carved into hard angles. There was no time for elegies. The world demanded the quick calculus of living or dying and would not accept my hesitation as an answer. After that, things went on without me, or I without them. My hands knew the lasgun's weight and found its balance. My eyes picked out shapes that moved with a predator's economy. The first time I noticed the change, I tried to name it. It felt like a layer being stripped away, a softness rinsed out until there was only the raw, working part left. I felt guilty for how easy it was to learn. The fear never left, but it became a useful thing, like a tool you kept in the pocket of your uniform. There were times when I could feel the old me at the base of my skull, like a sleeping thing, and times when that old self was so distant I could only touch it by pressing the pad of a thumb into the scar behind my ear. We advanced into the heavier barrage, because that was what had to be done. Orders do not come with explanations in moments like those. They come as a law, absolute and unnegotiable. The captain moved like a man with iron in his chest. He gestured us forward with a single, precise motion, as if he were shaping us into a tool. We obeyed because disobedience in that place meant simple, quick death. There is a different sort of death in war, one that arrives with the quiet of an unlit lantern. Disobedience brought that tight, certain silence. Obedience brought a chance, however small, to breathe another sunrise. I remember thinking about the things I had left behind on our march, doors I had walked through, a cot with an indent that fit my shape, a kettle that whistled louder than it should have. Those were not important in the tally of tactics, but they were the thin rope I had been pulling on in the dark, hoping it reached a shore. Each step forward felt like clenching that rope until the skin of my palm burned. Around me, men kissed amulets and cursed the sky with equal fervor. A corporal whispered a prayer in a dialect I did not know. The language of survival borrows everything. We crossed a flat of broken metal and scorched earth where the enemy had placed tripwired mines. There was a rhythm to moving through it. Probe, pause, step. The tripwires hummed with menace like invisible threads of spider silk. My boot missed a shard of rebar and slid. A cry rose up from the next man and cut off like a lamp being extinguished. I heard the awful smallness of his noise and felt immediately ashamed for still breathing. We pushed on because the captain pushed us, because his voice cut through the smoke like a blade. Between blasts, I could hear other sounds that did not belong to battle. Some small tune from a boy's throat, a coughing old man somewhere behind the lines, the call of a bird that had somehow survived this sky. Those things were tiny rebellions against the order the war tried to impose. Hearing them was like stepping into a doorway where someone had left the light on. I clung to them when I could. They were proof that there was a world not entirely remade into soot. At one point, the captain stopped us behind a shattered bulkhead and put a finger to his lips. There was a hollow where his eyes ought to have been, the look of someone who had kept too many secrets to feel safe in daylight. He whispered the plan. We would cut across the flank and hit the enemy's ammo dumps. The tone of his voice was spare, businesslike. No talk of glory, no melodrama. It was the sound of someone who knew the cost and refused to waste time bargaining for it. We readied grenades and stripped the safeties on our rifles, fitting ourselves to the task like men cinching armor. I wanted, briefly, scandalously, to refuse. In the small private chamber of my brain, I imagined walking away, dropping my rifle into a crater, and letting the wind take me elsewhere. The idea dissolved quickly. There was a geometry of responsibility in that place that did not care for private rebellions. If I left, someone had to fill the space. If I failed, the line curled and others paid. I did not trust myself to choose. So I stepped forward. I tightened my grip. The lasgun felt like the spine of a new kind of man, and in that pressure there was a peculiar reassurance. When the order came to move, it came as a simple, bright point. The captain clapped his hands, and the line bent like a reed. We flowed around the bulkhead and into the corridor beyond. Inside, the air was hotter, charged with the tang of overheated metal and the electric smear of energy weapons. My skin prickled. I could hear the hum of the enemy's batteries, low, like distant bees. Each step closer was an act of will. We were not going to be able to plan our grief. We had to make use of it, let it feed something useful, a focus, a reason to aim straight. As we slid through the corridor, I felt a small, almost obscene curiosity about how cleanly one could aim when every thought in the world was sharp. Could a man still be himself when his hands were trying to be instruments? Could he keep slivers of who he had been tucked inside, like flints? The questions did not have answers. We were too busy keeping our faces forward. The captain's silhouette was a hard edge ahead of me, and beyond him lay the open that waited to take whatever we gave. The barrage had grown, a thicker rain now, and the next crossing promised to be the loudest yet. I set my jaw, shouldered my rifle, and stepped off into it. The commissar's boots still shook the floorboards when he left, the echo-like judgment settling in the rafters. We held our breaths until it faded, each of us listening for the small betrayals of a soldier's body. A cough, a shiver, a foot that wouldn't stop tapping. Outside, the city breathed in slow, sulfurous pulls inside. We breathed the cigarette smoke until our eyes watered and the ash pooled like dead snow. We had been given a map, then a sentence. Take the rail hub at dawn, hold the eastern approach, and signal the armored column when night fell. Fail, and the commissar promised there would be no mercy for hesitation. He'd said it plainly, a blade in the room. He did not have to spell out the consequences. We knew them by the empty spaces in the mess lines and the way men looked away from the veterans whose courage had been spent. For the first hour, we moved like sleepwalkers, hands finding rifles, fingers testing triggers. The lighter in my pocket felt like a hot stone. Tomasz sat on a broken stair, one boot slung off, the bandage at his calf caked and dried. He had been hit by shrapnel 2 nights earlier, a thin silver track that refused to stop whispering pain. The Medica had warned us not to move him far. The captain had said the objective was more important than a single life. The commissar had said any delay would be treason. Music was a private rebellion in such places. Someone began to hum, a thin, old song from before, and the sound braided with the rain. It kept the corners of my brain from slipping into the logic the commissar wanted. The song said we were still human. The lightning outside agreed with no one. We had taken to keeping small things hidden. A loaf pinched from a commissary, halved between three, a cigarette stub passed beneath a blanket, a prayer whispered for no god at all. Those fragments kept us sane. They also made us vulnerable. If the wrong officer searched the right pack, the warmth of stolen bread could become a badge of mutiny. "Ready?" Corporal Dern asked, voice flat as the shell-green sky. He had a scar that cut his brow like someone had tried to map out his life. He was all business until a man dropped. Then his face betrayed him, and you saw the ledger of debts he kept. "Ready," Tomasz said too quickly, as if speed could outrun the pain. He propped his rifle against the wall. His breath came shallow. "Go easy," he added, and that was for me. Orders are a machine you feed with obedience. We had each been fed lies about glory and duty until the edges blurred. But in the hours before an impossible assault, the machine needed maintenance in the form of small kindnesses. We patched boots with spare webbing. We shared rations. We smoothed the hair of a comrade who could no longer do it for himself. Those acts were not altruism, they were survival. If the man next to you kept breathing, he could drag you out of a belly of fire. When the hour came, we filed out through a corridor that smelled of petrol and old fear. Outside, the hub lay like a skeleton, rails twisted, cranes like broken ribs, a platform dark as an eye. The objective was not ornate, it rarely is. It is a place that, if you take it, lets metal move and orders be obeyed. It is a lever in the machine. If you fail to take it, the whole machine jams. We moved in pairs, shadows in shadows. The captain pointed, and we obeyed. Drones hummed overhead, their lenses like hungry wasps. A flare burned the horizon in a color that made the dead seem closer than they were. Tomasz leaned on me when the pallet passed, and I realized my uniform smelled of oil and smoke and the faint tang of borrowed bread. "Keep low," I told him. It was the kind of thing you said to quiet the noise in a man's head. He smiled without humor. The bandaged leg protested with every step. I could have left him and kept pace. The objective would have been cleaner without the extra weight. Discipline would have told me to put the regiment's mission above a single life. But discipline is a language the dying do not speak. We had broken orders before. A small mercy here, a delayed report there. Once, the Medica had been nearly taken. For failing to report a fever, we hid her records under a crate of scrap. We paid with orders scratched off like old scars. The commissar's patience had limits, so did his tally. Each kindness added to a stack of risks that could topple us. Halfway to the hub, a sentry silhouette slid over a pile of ballast like a second ghost. He rounded a rusted container and barked, challenge and then quiet. A flare popped in the distance, a thin, furious blossom, and in that moment the world filled with noise. Distant engines, the cough of automatic fire, a child's laugh trapped in static. We pressed ourselves flat to the cold, letting darkness swallow outlines. Tomasz breathed against my shoulder like a bird. From the platform, a voice blasted orders, someone with authority, but not our authority. They were moving to reinforce the hub's defenders. The commissar's plan depended on surprise and speed. That voice shredded both. We had been counted on as the wedge. If the defenders tightened, there would be no place for the wedge to go. "Move," the captain hissed. He set a path that hugged the broken rails, using the twisted iron as partial cover. Ahead, a row of crates promised shelter and a vantage point. We slipped between them like thieves in prayer. Metal bit my palms where I climbed. The smell of oil and old blood made my stomach twist. A whistle cried out, not from us. It was a signal, sharp and clean, and a battery answered with stuttered booms. The first explosions blew the night away. Concrete spat up dust. A cloud of grit filled the world with sand. The captain swore, and we ran harder. Tomasz stumbled. The bandage had frayed. He fell against a wall and did not get up. Bullets stitched the air like angry insects. The corporal's shape folded over him and became a shield. The two kept him tight and moved. I could hear the commissar's voice in the back of my skull, ordering forward, forward, forward. If you hesitate, he had said, the community will cull you. But if you do not hesitate, you also become the mechanic for a machine that grinds men into fuel. The contradiction ate at me. It always had. The only way to keep my head from unraveling was to focus on the tangible. A man's shallow breath, the gritty taste of smoke, the small heat of a cigarette stub between my fingers. Can't leave him, Dern said. He sounded younger than his face. He keeps the lathe of the squad running. We carry him, or we don't go. It was not an order. It was a choice. Choices were heavier than orders. We lifted Tomasz. It was clumsy and human work. A panting, heaving arc of limbs, a cigarette dropped, boots scraping. A sniper stitched past the last crate where Wed stood 2 breaths before. The line of trajectory sizzled where my finger had been an instant ago. If a bullet had wanted to get us, it would have found us. We made it across the ruined concourse toward the rail hub, 1 man leaning on 3. The eastern approach lay ahead, a corridor flanked by gantries and rust, a line of sight that gave defenders mercy. The captain wanted to climb the gantry and take the watch. The commissar wanted the eastern approach held with the kind of cold precision that leaves no room for pity. We had both hands on Tomasz and nothing left to give but stubbornness. In the hub's shadow, we found a shelter the size of a coffin, a maintenance tunnel with collapsible screens and the smell of old insulation. We slotted Tomasz into a slanted alcove and worked in the pale flare light. Dern tore his shirt to reinforce the bandage. I fed Tomasz the last of the stolen loaf in crumbs. His eyes tracked me with gratitude sharpened into fear. There was a tremor in his jaw when he tried to smile. "Stay," the captain said. He was not saying stay here so much as buy me time. He shoved a map across a crate like a priest giving a blessing. Arrows and penciled notes, times and microtimes, all the things a plan needed to be less impossible. Take the eastern approach, take the signal mast, send up the lantern, and we get our armor through the line, he said. We don't wait. Help him if you can, I said, before I knew I would. The words meant more than a plea. They meant I would hold this corner while the rest of them went to do what soldiers were supposed to do, make themselves useful to the machine. The captain's face closed like it always did when he had to be responsible for lives. You look like you'll puke, Dern muttered, fumbling with a field dressing. He had a small laugh, bitter and sharp. I won't, I lied, because lying was better than letting the thought of leaving Tomasz to the hub's teeth become real. We redeployed with the captain's nod. The rest of us went forward along the plan the captain had drawn on a scrap, a splay of movement that relied on timing and distraction and the blind trust that men who were not trained for strategy invented on the fly. We had improvisation and a thin appetite for daring. It might have been enough. It almost never was. I watched the others go, the small silhouettes in the flare light, and in their backs I read 1,000 compromises. The commissars, shadow fell across all of them. It was not merely one man's authority, but the system's eye. We moved because we had to. We moved because we feared execution or the slow, grinding erosion of conscience. Left in the tunnel with Tomasz, I listened for the drum of boots. The world narrowed to the sound of his breath and the distant detonations that made the floor tremble in a rhythm like the heartbeat of a sleeping beast. A medica's bag heaped with stolen vials and bandages lay beside him, and the smell of menthol was faint in the air. It was ridiculous and holy how a scrap of cotton could be the difference between life and a whole. If the commissar learned we had delayed, the reprisal would be swift. It would not be philosophical. It would be a calculation executed with eyes that had grown tired of feeling anything. We had already borrowed against the mercy of faceless men at headquarters. The ledger was growing. "Do you think they'll make it?" Tomasz whispered. The tunnel had a way of swallowing sound. He asked it as if he were fishing for an answer that would make it legal to hope. "I think they have to," I said, because the truth would have been useless. Hope was a dangerous commodity, but it kept the joints moving. They have to. The sky spluttered with a line of tracer fire. They were closing in on the eastern approach. The captain's plan was either a miracle or a crime. There was no way to know which without stepping into it. A lighter flared to life in my hand, and I cupped the ember like a stolen sun. I thought of bread split 3 ways in a cellar, of a lullaby someone hummed to drown a commissar's sermon, of the way Dern's scar had softened when he laughed. Those small mercies stitched into one another like rope. We had agreed, silently, to be more than units. That agreement was not a law. It was a choice that made the commissar's blade less immediate, but no less real. I slid a strip of fabric under Tomasz's chin and tightened it with fingers that knew precision only when a life depended on it. He closed his eyes. Above, the assault cranked like a machine about to be started. Engines roared, men shouted. Time was a rope pulled taut. The captain had gone, ragged and relentless. The commissar's order still hung, strict, unforgiving, necessary, monstrous. I stood, lighter gone cold, and took one last look at the entrance where light bled into the tunnel. The men were out there, making our chances. The hub was a shape of iron and intention, indifferent to human mercy. We had weighed that indifference with bread and songs and the ragged kindness of carrying a friend. I tucked the medica's bag beneath Tomasz's head and tightened my grip on the rifle at my shoulder. The world had narrowed to a decision line and the thin, bright path beyond it. If we were to survive this, it would not be by obedience alone. I stepped toward the tunnel mouth. The captain's voice, a distant geometry across concrete and steel, cut through the night. The plan had started. The rest was movement, and movement required us to choose, to obey the commissar's cold calculus, or to carry our humanity like contraband across the eastern approach. We moved. The chevron sat heavy on my sleeve like a coin with both faces. When I first got it, I thought it would be a neat thing to fasten to my chest and forget. I was wrong. It changed how men looked at me. It changed how I looked at the floor. The cloth caught sweat and mud and the faint smell of boiled dates from a ration pack. At night, I would roll up my sleeve and trace the stitching with a fingertip, as if I could count the hours back from where they'd been spent on someone else's command. My hands remembered the weight of orders, even when my head did not. Responsibility arrived without trumpet fanfare. It arrived as a stack of small things that had to be done before dawn. Weeding the latrine drain, checking the respirators, waking the boys who dreamt too long, telling the gunners when to sleep and when to wake. Each act was tiny and final. You either got the bolt head tightened or you did not. You either checked the map or you walked your squad into the wrong canyon. The map smelled like grease and rain. It had a tear at the fold where I had unfolded it so many times that the paper gave up and refused to be flat. The world outside the map's lines was rumors and screams. My men were not models of heroism. They were farmers, dock hands, a baker with flour under his nails, a boy from a hive sector who still woke crying for a mother he had never known. They trusted me because I carried the chevron and because I had learned to speak when it mattered. I learned what to say and, more importantly, what to let lie. A truth said at the wrong time was like a mine. The blast came later, and everyone bled around the wound. So I patched their wounds in the dark. I listened. I fleshed out excuses for their lateness. I swapped bullets into the coffers of a man who needed one more day to visit a grave. The trade was simple. A minute of mercy earned hours of obedience. But mercy was a currency with a quick devaluation. Every leniency I paid out required another deposit of violence somewhere else to balance the ledger. Orders stacked like ration crates for every man I spared a reprimand. 2 more were marched into an operation where the odds were not in their favor. The world taught me arithmetic with corpses. I learned to be economical. I learned how to make choices that felt like alternatives between cold and colder. The bruises inside did not show. They settled like mud beneath skin, changing gait and glare. There were days I wanted to be cruel for the clarity of it. Cruelty simplified decisions into black and white checks. Shoot, do not shoot. A clean order and a clean conscience. But the easier path always left a hollow I could hear at night, the echo of someone's last words. Mercy complicated the math it braided the lives of men together, where once they might have been discrete, disposable units. I became a ledger of favors and debts, saved a man from summary execution, had to personally oversee a failed ambush, bought a bread ration for a grieving father, found his son absent from watch. Each act of compassion meant I had to pay later, with long hours in front of sleeping positions, polishing helmets, pretending the future was still negotiable. The uniform fit my shoulders without question. It did not fit my thoughts. The collar scraped at my throat in a way that felt like etiquette rather than armor. At parades, a brass plate flashed like an accusation. I stood at attention while inside my brain a catalog of small rebellions amassed. A diverted glance, a withheld report, a blank in the record book where a man's absence might have become an accusation. These were petty treasons compared to the statutes they violated, but they kept bits of me intact. I learned the language of deflection, how to say that a man was missing in action when the truth was that I had hidden him in an empty bunker until the bombardment moved past. I told lie after lie with the same measured cadence as I gave orders. Lies, I discovered, could be instruments of preservation. One day we were ordered across a blackened field to take a ruin the size of a cathedral. The ruin was not a single structure, but a heap of stone and the smell of old smoke. Artillery walked our line like bulldogs, stamping earth into the sky. I counted the men in my squad in the dawn light. Faces leaned toward me, wet with sleep and fear. A boy clutched a faded photograph of a woman who had probably never seen the stars beyond a holofan. Another chewed his lip until it bled. The world here, behind my eyes, was reduced to the distance between breaths. When the order came down to advance, I felt the smallness of command and its absolute demands. We moved as one, not because we shared belief, but because we had learned the rhythms of obedience. The slopes sucked at boots mud, whispered against ankles. Shellfire hissed in the distance like a swarm of angry insects. A man in my file fell and did not rise. He had been my responsibility for 3 months. I did not know his face well enough to mourn. With skill, I only knew the name he'd given me in confession. I dragged him behind a broken wall and closed his lips with my hand until the world could no longer claim him. My hands smelled of him for days. Later, there was a reckoning. A senior officer, a man with braided ranks speaking like hammered brass, wanted to know why a conscript had been missing from the line When the push began, the question was simple. It required causation. I caged the truth, picked it up like a living animal, and trained it to obey. I told the officer the man had been wounded in the initial barrage and separated in the smoke. The officer's face remained unreadable, as if he had the habit of dividing men into expendable columns and did not need the trouble of a story. For the lie, I paid. Quotas for future operations increased, our rations tightened. The ledger demanded repayment. You become an expert at small violences. You wake a man by striking him with your palm because shouting would have brought electrosentries. You ration water by giving the injured priority and letting the rest of the squad learn thirst. Each choice changed the contour of the group's trust. Men learned to watch me for the soft sign that they were safe for the day. They learned to trust the rhythm of my breathing. If I was steady, they could be asleep. If I was not, they fainted watchfulness into something like prayer. I kept a thing from home hidden beneath a false bottom in my boots. It was small and made of wood, a toy bird my sister had whittled. It was not impressive. It would not feed anyone. It smelled faintly of resin and childhood. I would take it out when the world quieted and watch the grain run between my thumbs. It had no tactical value. It did not improve firing arcs or morale reports. It became, in its meaningless way, an act of defiance. I told myself that as long as that bird did not rot, something essential had not been conscripted out of me. When a commissar came through our sector, the air itself curved. He wore the kind of uniform that had learned to civilize all other uniforms into submission. A commissar's eyes were small and clean, like knives. He read faces as if they were open ledgers. He spoke of duty like a sermon, of honor like currency, of obedience as salvation. I felt my throat close when he inspected my men. He turned to me and asked for my reports. I watched the commissar's mouth as if I might catch his words and reassign their meanings. I handed him my ledger of small mercies and small treasons. He skimmed it and found it broadly satisfactory. His satisfaction felt like frost on a wound. There was a moment, an instant that hung heavier than the rest, when he asked me if I would lead a night raid. It was precisely the sort of thing that could be used to erase a ledger, to spend all my hidden mercies at once in service to some strategic calculus. The commissar's eyes lingered on the chevron as if checking its hardness. The decision he asked of me was not a tactical one. It was a test of whether my small rebellions could be consumed to feed the machine. I prepared the men. We moved like ghosts under a sky that had stopped being kind. We skirted barbed wire and trod through puddles that reflected the ruin like a mouth. My squad's breathing was a metered thing, 6 in, 6 out, a rhythm I set, and they matched without question. I felt the chevron like a battery in my chest, powering the motions that kept others alive. We reached the enemy parapet and crouched in a walled shadow. The world microscope tightened. Everything was presupposition and finality. Then a sound, soft, insane in its wrongness, came from beyond the parapet. A child. The noise was not a war noise. It was a sound like a drawer pulled from a kitchen when it shouldn't be pulled. The men behind me stilled. Somewhere in someone's pocket a photograph slipped and faintly cracked. My breath found a placesless temple. Orders boiled in my head like oil. There was an easy answer, the metric answer, the one that carved away any lingering unnecessary humanity. Take the shot, secure the parapet, report clean. I did not take the shot. I remember the way my finger hovered and then unclenched. I felt the silence as if it were a third hand on my shoulder. The child made another noise, and a ragged voice answered back in a language I could not name, but understood by meaning. Someone was alive here, who was not meant to be. I tucked the bird from my boot into my palm. The wood was warm from my skin. I felt something in me that I had kept carefully cataloged for months and hidden from inventory. It was not bravery. It was not honor. It was that stubborn ember of smallness that refused to be accounted for. I put my rifle down. The squad's breath hitched like a collective animal. A man whispered, sharp and low, a question that trembled between accusation and pleading. I heard the commissar somewhere behind me, a presence I'd hoped to deceive by virtue of distance. I thought of the ledger and the payments coming due. I thought of the man who had once been mine and whose hands I had closed. I thought of the boy in my file clutching a photograph. For a moment, the world narrowed to a choice as simple as a hinge. I did not give an order. I did not call for retreat or charge. I slid forward on my knees, forehead pressed to cold stone. The child was a rag-wrapped bundle of life that shouldn't have been there. Someone else's misfortune, and constantly the universe's. I lifted the child and felt its thinness fit into my arms like a second, delicate ledger. The sound of that action, cloth against cloth, breath against breath, stung the night with a kind of blasphemy against the rules we'd all signed with our mouths. Behind me, the men shifted. Some cursed, some cried out. The commissar stepped forward then, close enough to blot my light. He smelled like ink and hot metal. He said my name, not like a challenge, but as a calculation. Will you abandon the objective for this? His voice was a scale with one pan filled by the parapet and the other by a wrapped bundle that looked at me with dark, wet eyes. I weighed the ledger in my hands. I could have handed the child to the commissar and marched the line forward. I could have fired a round into the darkness and made a clean account. Instead, I stood with the child tucked inside my uniform, my hand feeling the shape of the toy bird in my pocket as if it were an anchor. The decision sat in my throat like a stone. I turned to my squad and the men who looked to me for certainty. The moon washed their faces in indifferent silver. One of them, a baker, met my gaze and let his jaw loosen as if to make room for a different kind of order. The rest of the world, the one beyond the ruin, waited with its artillery asleep. Decisions sat like loaded rifles across a table. I could feel the ledger whispering for payment. I could feel every small mercy I'd spent calling me greedy. The choice I made then would not undo anything. It would only move the debt from one column to another. I breathed, tasted ash and memory. My hand closed around the bird, as if to make vows by proxy. Move, I said, softer than an order. It was not an instruction to charge. It was not even entirely a plan. It was an invitation to choose with me. The men watched. The commissar's mouth did something small and nearly human. Then I could not tell if it was amusement or disappointment. We moved, some towards the parapet, some into the shadowed alleys that led away. I carried the child and the bird and the weight of what I had become. The chevron at my arm scraped, a constant reminder and a stubborn thing. Ahead, the ruin waited like a new kind of book, pages uncut. I stepped into it and felt the world lean in, asking me to decide again.